It started as an ordinary morning in Accra, Ghana's calm and busy capital. The sun had just risen over the city, and the streets were already alive with the sound of traffic and people rushing to work. But inside one of the government halls where an African Peace and Leadership Forum was taking place, something unexpected happened. A moment that would soon shake the political conversation across West Africa began to unfold. Ghanaian President John Dramani Mahama stepped up to the podium to deliver what was expected to be a simple speech on peace and regional cooperation. Journalists, diplomats, and civil society leaders were in the room, many expecting the usual talk about trade, democracy, and youth empowerment. But Mahama's tone was different this time. He spoke slowly, firmly, and with a deep sense of conviction. It was clear from his voice that he had something on his mind, something that went beyond the normal political talk. After speaking about the importance of peace and stability across Africa, he paused, looked across the audience, and said something that immediately changed the mood of the room. He said, "Peace cannot grow where injustice is allowed to stay." Then he mentioned Nigeria by name. The entire hall went silent. In that moment, Mahama made what many would later call one of the boldest statements by a West African leader in recent years. He called for the immediate and lawful release of Nnamdi Kanu, the detained leader of the Indigenous People of Biafra. His words were calm but strong. He said no nation should be afraid of justice, and that unity cannot be forced through violence or suppression. He reminded everyone that leadership means listening, not silencing. Those words spread like wildfire. Within minutes, clips of his speech started circulating online. Journalists in the hall quickly tweeted the main line, "Mahama calls for Nnamdi Kanu's release, says peace cannot live with injustice." Social media exploded. People across Africa began sharing it, commenting, debating, and praising his courage. A respected statesman from another African country had openly stepped into Nigeria's most sensitive political issue. In Nigeria, the news landed with a heavy impact. Television networks started running breaking news banners with Mahama's name. Radio hosts opened their phone lines, and callers could not stop talking about it. Some Nigerians said it was about time someone from outside the country spoke up. Others were surprised that a former president of another nation would risk saying something so direct about Nigeria's internal matter. But for many, it wasn't about politics, it was about humanity. Mahama's words touched a deeper truth that has long been whispered but rarely said out loud by those in power. He spoke about the moral duty of African leaders to stand for justice, even when it is uncomfortable. He reminded everyone that injustice anywhere in Africa weakens the entire continent. Back in Accra, reactions continued to pour in. Ghanaian citizens, journalists, and politicians expressed mixed feelings. Some applauded him for being brave enough to speak on a matter that many governments prefer to avoid. Others warned that it could strain relations with Nigeria, one of Ghana's closest economic partners. But Mahama seemed unshaken. Those close to him said he had prepared for that speech carefully, knowing exactly what message he wanted to send. Observers said it was more than politics, it was leadership. Mahama had built a reputation over the years as a man who values dialogue and fairness. Even out of office, he has often spoken about democracy, peace, and human rights across the continent. So, when he mentioned Nnamdi Kanu's name, it wasn't just a random statement. It was a deliberate call for justice and a reminder that Africa must not stay silent when one of its own is in distress. In Nigeria, officials remained quiet at first. There was no official response from the government that day. But inside political circles, discussions began immediately. Analysts wondered what Mahama's statement meant for Nigeria's image abroad. Diplomats quietly admitted that it could bring new pressure from international organizations and regional blocs. A former president of Ghana calling out Nigeria over a human rights issue was not something that could easily be ignored. Meanwhile, in the southeast of Nigeria, the news sparked fresh hope among people who have long called for Nnamdi Kanu's release. Many saw Mahama's voice as a sign that the world was finally paying attention again. They said it gave new energy to the campaign for justice and peace in the region. By nightfall, the story had made headlines in major African media outlets. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Accra to Johannesburg, Mahama's statement was the top trending topic. Analysts debated his words, activists praised his courage, and citizens discussed what this could mean for Nigeria's future. Some said Mahama had done what other leaders feared to do, to speak the truth, even when it involves another government. Others argued that his intervention could open the door for more diplomatic talks about peace in Nigeria's southeast. But one thing was certain: the silence around Nnamdi Kanu's detention had been broken by a voice that carried weight and respect across Africa. It was a moment that felt both shocking and refreshing, a reminder that leadership does not end when power is gone. It continues in the courage to speak up, even from outside the corridors of government. And on that morning in Accra, John Dramani Mahama did just that. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply told the truth, and the truth, once spoken, began to echo far beyond Ghana's borders. John Mahama's decision to speak about Nnamdi Kanu did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of quiet observation, private conversations, and a growing sense of responsibility he could no longer ignore. For months, he had been following the political tension in Nigeria's southeast. He had watched how the case of Nnamdi Kanu had turned from a legal matter into a national wound, one that continued to divide opinions and test the strength of Nigeria's democracy. According to people close to him, Mahama had received multiple briefings about the situation from civil society groups and African human rights organizations. Many of these reports pointed to delays in the judicial process, restrictions on legal access, and the deep frustration among Kanu's supporters. To Mahama, this was not just Nigeria's problem. It was an African concern. He believed that when one part of the continent suffers from political injustice, the entire continent feels the effect sooner or later. As a man who has seen leadership from the top, Mahama understands the weight of silence. He knows that when leaders stay quiet in the face of injustice, it sends a dangerous message, that power is more important than fairness. That was what pushed him to finally break his silence. His close advisors say he had wrestled with the decision for weeks. He wanted to make sure his words were not misunderstood or seen as interference. But he also knew that speaking out was the right thing to do. Mahama has always been known as a moderate, someone who chooses words carefully and avoids unnecessary confrontation. So, when he finally spoke, his tone was calm but deeply intentional. He was not trying to embarrass Nigeria. He was trying to remind Africa of its moral compass. In his speech, he mentioned that Africa cannot preach peace to the world while turning a blind eye to internal injustice. That message was clear and firm, and it came from a place of deep conviction. Behind the scenes, African leaders have been worried about the growing insecurity in Nigeria's eastern region. The continuous tension, protests, and military operations have created fear that could easily spill across borders if not managed properly. Mahama, having served as a regional statesman for years, knows the cost of instability. He understands how quickly local unrest can become a regional crisis. That was another reason he felt compelled to speak. He also remembered the history of Africa, how silence from neighboring countries during times of crisis has often led to greater pain later. In his view, Africa must no longer wait for outside powers to call for justice. Africans must hold themselves accountable. That was the heart of his message, that true African unity must include fairness, compassion, and the courage to correct each other when things go wrong. His words carried emotional weight because they came from a man who has lived the highs and lows of leadership. Mahama knows what it feels like to be criticized, misunderstood, and blamed. But he also knows that leadership is not about comfort, it is about conscience. That is why his message about Nnamdi Kanu's release sounded less like a political statement and more like a moral appeal. In Nigeria, the reaction to Mahama's speech was mixed but loud. Supporters of the government saw it as unnecessary interference, while many others saw it as a bold act of truth-telling. Political analysts on Nigerian television said Mahama had done what few African leaders dare to do, to speak up for justice beyond their own borders. They called it a reminder that leadership continues even after leaving office. International observers praised Mahama's courage, saying his statement could reopen dialogue and encourage diplomatic efforts to bring peace to Nigeria's southeast. Some even suggested that the Economic Community of West African States, known as ECOWAS, might now feel pressured to pay more attention to Nigeria's internal human rights issues. Mahama's voice, they said, had broken a silence that many African politicians were afraid to touch. For ordinary Africans, the speech was inspiring. People began to see it not just as a political move, but as an act of solidarity. It reminded them that Africa can look after its own. It reminded them that even former leaders have a role to play in guiding the continent toward fairness and respect for the law. As one Ghanaian journalist wrote the next day, Mahama spoke what many have been whispering. He gave courage a voice. In that moment, it became clear that this was not simply about Nnamdi Kanu. It was about something larger, a message that justice should never be defined by fear, and that peace without fairness is only temporary. Mahama's voice joined the growing chorus of people around the world asking Nigeria to choose dialogue over detention and reconciliation over repression. And while some may disagree with his position, one thing cannot be denied: his message touched hearts across borders. It showed that the call for justice is not a national issue but a human one. And in standing up for that truth, John Mahama reminded Africa what real leadership looks like, leadership that speaks softly but carries the strength of conscience. When John Mahama's words reached the public, they moved faster than anyone expected. Within hours, the video clip of his speech was trending on major social media platforms across Africa. People replayed his calm but firm voice as he called for the release of Nnamdi Kanu, and every line seemed to echo louder each time it was shared. It was as if his message had touched something that many had been feeling but could not express: a need for fairness, peace, and true justice. In Nigeria, the reaction was immediate. Television programs devoted full segments to the story. Analysts debated whether Mahama's statement was a diplomatic warning, a moral reminder, or both. Across different radio stations, people called in with strong emotions. Some were surprised that a former Ghanaian leader would speak so directly about Nigeria's internal matter. Others said it was long overdue, that Africa needed leaders who could speak the truth without fear. Social media became a battlefield of opinions. Hashtags like #FreeNamdiKanu, #MahamaSpeaks, and #JusticeForKanu started trending across Nigeria, Ghana, and beyond. Many Nigerians, especially young people, praised Mahama for showing courage. They said his words gave them renewed hope that Nnamdi Kanu's case had not been forgotten. For them, it was a sign that the world was beginning to pay attention again. Even among people who did not support Kanu's methods, there was quiet agreement that his long detention without a clear conclusion had created more division than unity. They said Mahama's message was not about politics, it was about the principle of justice. And that principle, they believed, must apply to everyone equally, no matter who they are or what they believe in. In Ghana, Mahama's statement continued to dominate conversations for days. Political commentators discussed its potential impact on Ghana-Nigeria relations, while others praised it as an example of true African leadership. The Ghanaian press described the speech as a call from the conscience of Africa. Editorials argued that silence in the face of injustice benefits no one, and that leaders like Mahama were needed to speak truth across borders. Meanwhile, in Abuja, the Nigerian capital, things became tense. Government officials stayed mostly silent, but insiders said discussions were going on behind closed doors. Some advisors warned that ignoring Mahama's statement could make Nigeria appear defensive, while others argued that responding would only give the story more international attention. It was a delicate situation, one that Nigeria's leadership could not easily dismiss. Diplomatic sources said that a few other African figures had also begun to quietly reach out to Nigerian officials, urging dialogue and reconciliation. Though not all spoke publicly, it was clear that Mahama's courage had inspired others to reconsider their silence. It had opened a door for a wider African conversation about justice, unity, and the rule of law. In the southeast region of Nigeria, the mood shifted. Communities that had long felt ignored suddenly felt seen. People spoke with renewed optimism, believing that Mahama's voice could bring moral pressure strong enough to push for change. In markets, churches, and local gatherings, his name became a topic of discussion. It was as if his message had reignited hope that peace could still be achieved without bloodshed. The international community also took note. African media houses across Kenya, South Africa, and Senegal began covering the story in depth. Commentators on global news platforms described Mahama's words as a turning point in regional diplomacy. They said his statement reminded the world that Africa does not need outsiders to stand up for justice, Africans can do it themselves. As days passed, the impact of that single speech continued to grow. It changed the tone of the conversation around Nnamdi Kanu's case from anger to reflection. People began asking deeper questions, not just about his release, but about how Nigeria could heal the divisions that have built up over the years. Even some politicians who had remained quiet began to speak cautiously about reconciliation and dialogue. Civil society groups in Nigeria started organizing peaceful forums and press conferences, echoing Mahama's words about peace and fairness. And for Mahama himself, he said nothing more after that speech. He didn't need to. The words had already done their work. They had started a conversation that could not be stopped, a conversation about leadership, courage, and the moral duty to speak when others remain silent. In the end, his call for Nnamdi Kanu's release became more than a political statement. It became a symbol, a reminder that truth has no border, and justice has no nationality. His message reached beyond Ghana and Nigeria. It reached into the hearts of ordinary Africans who still believe that the continent's strength lies in compassion, unity, and moral courage. And as the days turned into weeks, one thing became clear. John Mahama's voice had not only echoed across borders, it had awakened the conscience of a continent that had stayed quiet for too long. Because sometimes, it takes just one voice to remind millions that justice delayed is not peace achieved.